I don't think so, but just in here. Okay. And then, and here it's the same. Okay, right.
Same place.
It was full of NYI and then UCC and then
Yes.
full of
Yes.
Hola. So it is my pleasure today to present Dr. Margaret Brehony. Dr. Margaret Brehony is a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Global Research Fellow at the Moore Institute, University of Galway, and the School of Irish Studies, Concordia University, Montreal. Her research interests include Irish migration to Latin America and the Caribbean, Atlantic slavery, intersections of gender, race, and colonial strategies of ethnic widening. A graduate of University of Galway, Margaret also earned an MA in Digital Arts and Humanities from University College Cork. She is president of the Society for Irish Latin American Studies and co-editor with Nuala Finnegan of Irlanda y Cuba, Historias Entretejidas, Ireland and Cuba, Entangled Histories, Boloña, Havana, 2019.
Thanks, Viviana. And thanks to everybody for organizing this. Special thanks to ABE, IACE, and the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs for inviting me to come and speak. It's a tremendous honor. And it's been wonderful to hear all the different contributions by scholars in this part of the world and hear the different perspectives on Irish studies. It just makes it all much more interesting. And it's wonderful to go away knowing the kind of work that's happening here. It's so impressive and very exciting and fresh work. So I'll begin talking about digital humanities and Irish migration studies. The geographical reach of Irish migration studies in Latin America presupposes the use of archival sources scattered across myriad national archive repositories in Ireland, in Spain, and throughout the Americas, also in England, in London, mostly. And this is not to mention the innumerable sources. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm always told my voice is low. This isn't to mention the innumerable sources in provincial archives, ecclesiastical records, civil registers, census records, and we've had some exposure of the kind of information that you can get from those sources over the last 2 days. Others are passenger lists, cemetery registers, and newspapers. Newspapers everywhere have something to offer. So these pre-digital historical records comprise our bridge, really, to the history of Irish people and their descendants who settled and contributed to Latin American and Caribbean societies. With the globalization and digitization of knowledge, it's well underway, as we all know. Digital archives not only contribute to preserving the historical record, they also provide access to archives from anywhere in the world. And this is something that we were really grateful for when we couldn't travel. And even when we can travel, it's sometimes way too expensive and the funds aren't there to get to the sources. So in addition to recovery of endangered, destroyed or lost records, access to digital collections, it is really transforming our knowledge by permitting more critical engagement with multiple new voices, previously absent, silenced or ignored in the dominant or official narratives of history. Digital humanities then can enhance this potential through new, more advanced interdisciplinary methods of analysis using digital tools. So the project that I'm working on, Cuba Ireland Digital Archive, it studies Irish migration to Cuba in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it's creating the first open access digital archive of Irish settlement in the Hispanic Caribbean. It's funded by the European Union through a Marie Curie global fellowship. This study is in the context of plantation slavery in colonial Cuba, and it presents an entangled history of multiple voices, lives, and experiences that establish previously unacknowledged connections between Irish people, other Europeans, and Caribbean people of African descent. My paper will discuss the challenges and potentials of the project as it develops in the digital world. I'll look at the source archives for a little bit, also the digital archival process, the ethics of representation, and finally the curatorial process on Omeka, which is a digital open source platform. And then hopefully we'll get time to look at some of the digital humanities analysis tools that we intend to use. We've begun, but it's at an early enough stage. And I'm saying we because there are three of us working directly on the project. Myself, based in Montreal at the moment, also Giselle Garcia Gonzalez, that you probably some of you know, who's a member of the SILAS executive. She's really our digital humanities expert, I would say. And also another member of the team based in Cuba, Chris Sanchez Gonzalez, a Cuban researcher. So we're at an early stage in our development, and I'd hoped that we would be online by now, so that I could actually, show off our wonderful digital archive. But in fact, we're not there yet. There's always something. It's like building a house. It takes twice the time and twice the amount of money. But I can talk about the story of how it has evolved over the course of a global pandemic, over the course of late and slow development of internet resources in Cuba, and a few hurricanes thrown in, and the hacking of IT systems in Ireland, all of which has delayed our online presence and visibility. So I'll talk you through as best I can the kind of back end of the process, and the kind of decisions that we make as we're trying to construct this archive. So we'll see how time goes. I did think I might talk about sort of a wider context of digital humanities, and also in the context of centenary commemorations in Ireland and the amount of digital collections that were built during that time. It really did progress in Ireland, and it is everywhere really at this stage, but Ireland was a little bit behind. So and I'll also highlight some of the key challenges to producing and accessing cultural heritage records using digital collections. So in this era of mass digitization and rapidly expanding possibilities for digital humanities, I'll frame today's topic on creating a digital archive of sources about Irish migration to Cuba within the wider field of archive theory, digital cultural heritage, and digital humanities scholarship. Since the 1990s, access to digital collections has transformed the scope and direction of every research discipline, something which the late pioneering digital historian Roy Rosenzweig described as a fundamental paradigm shift away from a culture of scarcity to a culture of abundance. Is that readable? Very small print, but at least you get the name of the Center for Digital History. Along with the multidisciplinary team, Rosenzweig set up the first digital history center in the US, combining new media and information technology. This was in 1994 in George Mason University, Virginia. The platform that we're using, Omeka, actually comes from this center. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I go on. So Rosenzweig, having worked in the area of labor and urban history, public history, and collective memory, he and his group were concerned to democratize history as they saw it on the World Wide Web, and with the aim of making digital surrogates of historical sources available online. Public access was also a priority for them, and Rosenzweig cautioned against putting, and I quote, the future of the past, traditionally seen as a public patrimony, into private hands. So in the analog world, that what has been preserved about the past has an impact on historical research. Equally, the digitization of archives and cultural heritage shapes the stories we tell ourselves about the past, something that is amplified in the digital world by virtue of the choices made about what is preserved and what isn't. So digital scholarship then, it's an umbrella term for modern scholarship using digital methods, or tools or approaches. It's used to define a set of functions and services that enable newer forms of scholarship in universities, cultural institutions, and other research institutions. This is often within the digital arena and can encompass library-focused research enablement, open publishing, and using digital tools for analysis such as social network analysis and other areas, particularly in literary studies. It's an emerging field, one that is gathering momentum at quite a pace. But the problem with defining digital humanities is that it doesn't conform to a disciplinary method in a strict sense. It is what the digital allows you to do in facilitating or enabling research or pedagogy. And pandemic times have also taught lots of us about using digital tools for teaching, all about learning and teaching online. It's been an explosion of, I think, learning and discovery. But a good understanding of the field of digital humanities, I think, is that it facilitates new modes of humanistic inquiry using digital tools. When we talk about the digitization of archives, there's a shift away from favouring representing of archival fonds in terms of hierarchies towards favouring a view of the fonds or collections as networks with interconnected relationships. And this is one thing that, you know, I certainly find to be really useful is that, you know, you're making links across archives rather than, you know, searching down through a collection. So this is a paradigm shift, according to Caroline Brown, writing about archival futures, one that she says is indicative of a larger shift in human schemas of thought and the social and material world, the shift to networks, end of quote. Networks represent a different organizing principle that invokes decentralization in forms of thought or a hive mentality. Social networks as a mode of action. And in the material world, the internet and the World Wide Web. So the modus operandi is one that seeks to be globally connected, thus transcending the national or the particular. And, you know, this as already you can see has, you know, tremendous sort of application, I think, to looking at transnational migration. So digital, you know, this as an emerging field, there are many emerging scholars as well in the area. I'm not going to go into that too much here now. Digital adds value to the humanities, but the question of meaning lies in the interpretation of data culled from literary or quantitative humanities objects. And in the area of digital literary scholarship, digital tools such as distant reading and text mining, topic modeling, etc., can be used on large corpora, such as the Internet Archive, or drawing from social sciences, applying social network analysis to study plays, novels, reception, and the history of literary productions. So here we begin to see the crossover and interplay between disciplines through digital humanities, either drawing on previously discipline-specific methodologies, or indeed crossing disciplines to arrive at a methodological approach. And to give you some you know, some of the things that have come out of it, as you know, the tools for knowledge distribution, and you'll see some of the tools up here. If you go into this website, I'm not going to do it here. You'll see some of the tools that they have built, and this particular centre, all of their what's on offer there is open access. It's free. It's maintained. It's sustainable. You know, it's not something that's going to disappear too quickly. And they keep coming up with new iterations of tools. And I mean, if you have any interest in it, that's, I think, the first port of call. So let's see. So for those of us working on archives, whether parchment, paper, or digital editing and archiving and curating first of all, before you do any of that, there is the work of collecting. And we've seen what that is like from a lot of the presentations here. The time consuming collection that has to happen first. So then the most labor intensive stage is, once you find your sources, is transcribing from manuscript sources, certainly, to Word format, from which then the data is culled or extracted. And it's what they call, the data is also cleaned up and processed in order to use tools such as social network analysis, visualizations, spatial history, or mapping. And Excel really is the best sort of place to do all of this, to have it ready, to then apply digital tools to the analysis. So before going any further, I'd like to just talk a little bit about archives. And I'll start, since most people here I think are literary scholars, I thought I'd start with a literary source by a writer of historical fiction, the late great Dame Hilary Mantel, who died only 2 weeks ago. She wrote, "Evidence is always partial. Facts are not truth, though they are part of it. Information is not knowledge, and history is not the past. It is the method we have evolved of organizing our ignorance of the past. It's the record of what's left on the record. It's the plan of the positions taken, when we stop the dance, to note them down. It's what's left in the sieve when the centuries have run through it. A few stones, scraps of writing, scraps of cloth. It is no more the past than a birth certificate is a birth, or a script is a performance, or a map is a journey. It is the multiplication of evidence of fallible and biased witnesses, combined with incomplete accounts of actions not fully understood by the people who perform them. It's no more than the best we can do, and often it falls short of that." And she went on to say, "It's in imagination, we chase the dead, we shout at them to come back." I thought it was it's a very fitting statement. So most of you probably know this book, Silencing the Past, by the Haitian anthropologist, Michel Rolph Trujillo. And I think he really gets to the root of the question of knowledge production based on historical sources in his seminal book, Silencing the Past, when he says, and I quote, "Historical traces are inherently uneven. Sources are not created equal." As such, according to Trujillo, archives, and I quote, "are not mere presences and absences. Rather, they are constituted by," and I quote, "mentions or silences of various kinds and degrees." In arguing that absences are constitutive of the process of historical production, Trujillo concludes that, and I quote, "sources are about something else." He takes us through the mechanism of historical recording in this book of the Haitian Revolution to demonstrate that historical facts are not created equal. They reflect differential controls of the means of historical production. And I quote, "Inequalities experienced by the actors lead to uneven historical power in the inscription of traces. Sources built upon these traces in turn privilege some events over others, not always the ones privileged by the actors. Sources are thus instances of inclusion, the other face of which, of course, is what is excluded." This is from Michel Trujillo. His incisive and brilliant interrogation of power in Silencing the Past illuminates the process of refusal by the Western world to acknowledge the Haitian Revolution and the most successful slave revolt in history. Moving on then to Michel Foucault, who's been mentioned quite a few times over the last couple of days. In his Archaeology of Knowledge, 1969, he dispensed with the notion of archives as simply a repository of stored historical documents and artifacts, but more that they represent the memory of a discourse of a particular time. He reimagined the archive as an analytical concept, one that was historically embedded. And when writing about systems of knowledge, Foucault provokes us to think about the archive as a system of statements with rules of practice that shape what can and what cannot be said. And as in the Panopticon mentioned by Christina yesterday, Foucault honed in on the methodologies of archiving, a technology influenced by the politics of a discourse it serves as a memory for. Then post Foucault, obviously he came before Trujillo, and also another anthropologist, Anne Laura Stoller. In her book, Along the Archival Grain, she applies Foucault's concepts to her work on colonial archives. She uses terms like colonial common sense and the colonial archive of things to describe colonial archive productions. And really, colonial archives are the only ones I've ever worked on. So, this has great resonance when I'm working on the archives. In her analysis, she pays close attention to the relationship between archiving, experts and knowledge production. Colonial archives, she argues, are a supreme technology of the imperial state, a repository of codified beliefs that clustered and bore witness to connections between secrecy, the law, and power. So in a more recent survey of a wide range of archives then, cultural critic and Asian studies scholar Lisa Lowe, in her book, The Intimacies of Four Continents, in 2015, she outlines the archival method and technology of state archives and analyzes ways in which they are organized and segregated according to colonial hierarchies to reproduce narratives in which, and I quote, racial classifications and colonial divisions of humanity are naturalized. Her interdisciplinary work examines the relationship between Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the Americas, in which she links empire, slavery, and capital. And to do this, she works across multiple archives in different locations in metropolitan centers and colonial archives in post-colonial states. And there's a world of a difference between both sets of archives. So why am I going back over all this ground and the genealogy of knowledge production based on archival systems? Well, it helps and it's important to interrogate the analog technologies used in colonial archives that produced discourses of colonialism, migration, slavery, etc. Migration, whether forced or otherwise, all these discourses are, very well articulated in the archives. It makes one more alert to the problems of the unevenness of sources in the Trujillo sense, for instance, but also the imbalances in representation in historical narrative. And I refer here to the paucity of sources left by the subaltern and the peripatetic migrant or enslaved African people, for example. Also women seem to have gone missing in these archives. These problems are not necessarily diminished with the digital turn, but we may consciously refuse to replicate the silences, the absences, and distortions in the choices that we make as to what to include and what to exclude from digital collection. So my project sets out to retro-digitize early 19th and century manuscripts, 18th and 19th century manuscripts. And it involves documenting also, as part of the process, documenting the kinds of choices that I make when choosing what to digitize and how to extract data and how to interpret it. None of this is a neutral process. So, being as transparent as possible within the process and explicit is I think, a great thing to try and do. So hence the need for transparency in choices made at the pre-digital selection stage. They need to employ, and also the need to employ documented editorial principles that avoid replication of biases from the original data sets, all of which require methodological rigor to ensure greater balance of representation. Of course, no digital collection can be all-inclusive either, but we can aim at least to state clear parameters. The Digital History Centre that I mentioned earlier has developed resources such as you can see on the slide. And, you know, they're I think, well worth looking into because they're all very much in tune with this type of a methodology of, you know, just being really clear about what you're setting out to do, what you're collecting, what you're putting in, what you're not putting in, and the reasons why. So because also the selection process with, you know, digital data collection is more surgical and deliberate. They talk of cleaning up your data. You know, I always find that a little bit scary, you know, because I think, well, what's going to be left out in this great big cleanse? But you know, I think what they mean by cleaning up the data, it's sort of refining the data into a format that can be, you know, analyzable through digital means. Choice is made as to what goes in and what is left out. Yeah, I've said that. They're never neutral. Similarly, there are biases, both conscious and unconscious, and computational in the algorithms at play. And this, of course, affects the digitization of historical sources. So to go on to the actual project. So we can begin to see, you know, from looking at how people have thought about archives, how archives are set up, how they're managed, the technology of knowledge that goes into it. We can see some of the epistemological challenges to understanding an entwined history of Irish and African diasporas in Cuba and the wider Caribbean. Not to mention constructing an archive to explore these connections and the interactions between these people across time. Clearly, the excavation of this history would benefit from closer engagement across colonial archives and by reading from multiple perspectives, particularly that of poorer migrants, women, and Black diasporic lineages through enslaved Africans, who had links to Irish slave owners. Once these links are acknowledged, it is, and I quote from African American studies scholar Saidia Hartman. Where is she gone? I think back. She says, it is by playing with the basic elements of the story, by re-presenting the sequence of events in divergent stories and from contested points of view, that we find new voices in the social, economic and political context in which migrants moved, whatever country they moved to. Many of the stories that emerge from centuries of loss and violence are painful and troubling. But the fact that they continue to haunt the present of who we are demands our attention, if only, and I quote Hartman, if only as something akin to remedy, as a corrective to our interrogation of the past. Moreover, when reading the archive from decolonial, feminist, and Black perspectives, those of Irish origin come more clearly into view, and we could include Indigenous perspectives as well there. Our people of Irish origin come more clearly into view in the multiple overlapping social networks between and across class, gender, race, in the violent power dynamics of the Caribbean, of Caribbean slavery. Using the same approach when searching for the voices of people of African origin with Irish surnames, Hartman advocates that, and I quote, by listening to the unsaid, translating misconstrued words, and refashioning disfigured lives, and intent on achieving an impossible goal, redressing the violence that produces numbers, ciphers, and fragments of discourse, which is as close as we can come to a biography of the captive and the enslaved. So, you know, we really get a sense of the challenge of trying to, you know, decipher the experience with all these layers. So how am I doing on time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So Research that's mindful of the limits of the archives distorted by protocols of coloniality and power remains to be incorporated into a national or transnational narrative of Irish migration and Atlantic history. And if we are to recruit the past for the sake of the living, an ethical remembering, whereby the repair of ruptures in narrating connected diasporic histories elucidate, and I quote from Hartman here, who we are in relation to who we have been. This calls for a critical reading of the archives that aims to correct long-standing and erroneous assumptions about Irish involvement in Atlantic slavery and the impact on Irish and Cuban history and identity. So I'll move on. I think I have a bit more there on archives, but and the sort of talking about.
Maybe we can have 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think I'll talk about the archive.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So our aim in this digital archive is to decolonize and democratize the historical record. So the first step is to assemble an accessible corpora. And the archives that we are looking at are in Cuba, Spain, and London for digitization. But I'll give you a look at some of the sources here, which are all manuscript. There is nothing digitized. They're in, difficult enough conditions to access, and some are legible, others are not. There's very little resources to sort of preserve and conserve these manuscript documents, and that is another, unevenness in the resources that are available to people in different archives. You go to Spain, to the historical archives in Madrid, and you'll find this very same documents in absolutely pristine condition. It's fascinating to compare the experience of working in the metropole and the periphery. But there is, it's a very good experience, to actually be in the archives and, handle these documents and, actually see how they're assembled, how they're created. It certainly brings you into that time and into the minds of people a bit more than looking at something on a digital archive. But, I would always say to people, if you can at all, go to the original, but obviously that's not always possible. So the first thing is then to select how I have approached it in somewhere like Cuba, where you can put Irlandeses into look through any of the index boxes, the cards. There's nothing under Irlandeses. So what I have done is really a systematic trawl of the National Archives in Cuba, under certain things like the railroad certainly turned up quite a few documents. Also, the Council for White Population was another great source. Things like looking at the best source of all was the Protocolos Notariales, where you get all kinds of information, including wills and testaments, which, none of these documents were written for researchers. They were written for other reasons. But yet, we're trying to extract biographical details out of them. And it's, amazing the kinds of detail about people's lives and their connections that you'll get from all kinds of sources like this. Civil registers, obviously, and ecclesiastical records. But looking at, somebody else mentioned it, I think Mariano, looking at, the padrino who stood for them in the baptism. You begin to build this social network. And so what we're doing with then, the documents, link. I'm going to try and link you into the back end of and some of the, the documents that we're working with, the data sets that we're creating in extracting, we're like transcribing into a Word document and then tagging names, places, institutions, anything that will give us, a record of people's biographical information, their movement, their connections. So putting it all into Excel like this, it can then be exported and migrated into other tools to actually perform something like social network analysis. So, I mean, you probably can't read much of that, but you get an idea of the kinds of categories that are there, you know, would be each person has their own identity on the database. And we've put a lot of work into trying to identify people who, you know, don't have much of an identity in the archives. Migrant workers, you know, you might get just a name. They might have signed a document with an X, but there might be a date, or there might be some other little piece of information. We put everything in, each person, no matter even if they're on a list, including people who, you know, lists of enslaved people that belong to Irish migrants or Irish immigrants. You know, generally speaking, those people are, you know, listed as if, you know, as chattel, as property, not as they're not given a human identity. So we're trying to build also that into it, giving people, each person their own individual identity in as much as we can. Apart from, you know, it is the correct thing to do to give everybody equal respect in this archive. We're also, you know, we found that they appear across other archives, and because we've tagged them in our data sets, we begin to build the relationships by looking at when they appear in other documents. It'll come to our attention much more quickly. While it's time consuming doing all this, it also kind of allows you to see things that it may take you years to see if you were to actually physically yourself go through and try to cross-reference all these different documents. Next one there. Yeah, no, we won't bother with that for now. I'll just go back to the PowerPoint. I could show you documents, but everybody has seen the kinds of documents that the manuscript documents from the archives in varying states of decay and, you know, absolute perfection. Documents that are 200 years old, as if they were written yesterday. So you can see it's a great range of sources across different institutions. Newspapers are a very big source. Okay, well, that's okay. So just to go on there, we're you know, then migrating all of this onto Omeka, which is a platform for archive. It's used by museums, by libraries, university libraries, libraries in general, it's content management platform. So it's a great place to hold all your archives, but also organize them and curate exhibitions, for instance, you know, curate sort of family stories, individual stories, community stories. And, you know, you can do it quite nicely, make it, you know, fairly attractive to the user, and also make it interactive. People can also download your data from this to do what they want with, you know, and that is the hope in putting this, you know, all centrally in one place, that people anywhere can use it to, you know, I don't know, write a play, make a movie, write a novel, or you know, do a historical analysis of one kind or another, linguistic analysis. There are many, you know, there's so many disciplines that can be brought to bear on this data. And that's another great reason for, you know, getting it all together in one place. So we're at the stage of migrating it onto the platform. We've organized our data, transcribed hundreds of documents. And I hope by the end of the year that I'll be able to, you know, send out an email and say it's there. You can take a look for yourself. Hopefully, yeah, but you never know with these things. There's always you know, there's many little hurdles along the way. Some of them, you know, way out of our control. So that's really the other kind of thing about this type of, you know, digital production is that metadata is a big part of it, and we use the Dublin course system, which is not Dublin, Ireland. I think it's Dublin, Ohio, but it's a system of cataloging and metadata that allows you to aggregate your collection with other libraries. For instance, we could integrate this into the Digital Repository of Ireland, for instance, or we could integrate it into the Digital Library of the Caribbean. And also it allows you to link your data with data in other places. You can link to something that is relevant or interesting. You don't necessarily have to sort of start from the beginning and bring it all into yours. So that's the other thing that it allows us to do. And that opens up huge possibilities. We'll also have a bibliography through Zotero, and there'll be lots of kind of annotated documents as well available. And I think that's probably, without actually being able to show it to you, and giving it to you in words, it's not the same. But I hope I've given you an idea of what it all will be like. It's hosted in NUI Galway, University of Galway. The name changed a couple of weeks ago. And it's hosted in the Hardeman Library under the Digital Collections section. And some of you have probably used that collection. It's got lots of, the Abbey Theatres there, Druid documents are there, McGahern's papers. And one of the kind of really interesting ones that it will be there soon is Kirby Miller's archive of 5,000 emigrant letters. So I suppose to finish off by saying that, this has, I think, great potential for Irish Latin American studies. Already on the SILAS website, we have, Excel files with tons of data there, and it sits there. There's so much more could be done with it, to allow us to see new connections, to allow us to see new patterns of movement that we haven't thought about before, maybe. And then it's something that can be constantly added to as new research comes on stream. So, it has, I think, in the long run, really tremendous value to add to what we have already in the area of Irish Latin American studies. So I'll leave it there. And if you've any, I'm sure, there are people who've used a lot of these tools already here that maybe you want to give us some advice. Okay, so.
Thank you very much, Margaret. It's been fascinating, really. And do we have time for questions, Veronica? One question? Half a question? Okay.
Un segundito. Ahí. Thank you very much, Margaret. That was a wonderful indication, a statement of the possibilities of the digital humanities and what's happening in relation to Cuba. I must say it's a superb project, and we look forward to hearing more, perhaps at the SILAS meeting next year in Galway. It might be possible to see the advances that you will have made by then. But no, I just want to make the point that, of course, you're speaking to an audience here in Argentina where the archives, of course, are not digitized or digitalized in any form. And this, of course, is a major concern because, of course, there is a deterioration taking place. We talked earlier today in relation to Viviana, the publication of McManus from Donegal, and and we have newspapers, we have other resources which remain. Of course, you talked about democratization of the archives, and I think that's a very valid term to use in the context of the archives in this part of the world. And the question is how best to advance that agenda. And we were looking also at the work of Coughlin in terms of the genealogical research that he did, an extraordinary piece of work which was done by a man working from index cards and who produced what is simply an extraordinary analysis of the of Irish migration to Argentina. So it's a project which I think a lot of us believe is the priority to move forward, and we're looking forward to working with those who are already active. And we were thinking particularly in the context of your research and the way you have gone about this project and what we can draw from it. And I hope that an outcome from this meeting will precisely be the establishment of a basis so that we can take this forward. And hopefully we will be able to, by next year at least, be able to have identified how we're going to do so, and perhaps make a report, as it were, to the SILAS meeting next year on this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. And I mean, this started out as something very, it's small, relatively speaking, but it's grown way beyond my expectations. So, you know, to sort of a modest start is well worth going for, because it'll surprise you, you know, how much it'll sort of grow organically, and the funding comes, you know, from somewhere.